Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Candela, I'm a student of psychology and I'm an intern in Gemma. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Gemma Carlier. Hi Gemma, welcome. And
hello.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit about your introduction in your background. Okay, so Gemma Carlier is an occupational therapist with over 20 years of experience. Gemma has worked in mental health settings with child and adolescent mental health services, a chronic fatigue children's pathway, and has worked independently with neurodiverse children and young people through schools, charities, local authorities, and for individuals and families. She qualified as an expert witness for the Educational Tribunal, and Gemma is currently employed as a lecturer by the University of Essex. So how does it sound if we start some questions already? I'm going to read them and then you can take your time and reply.
Right, that sounds good.
Perfect. So the first one is, can you explain to us how breathing techniques could benefit autistic children and what it does to our bodies?
Yes, of course, yeah. Breathing techniques or breathing strategies really help all of us to be able to switch from a state where we are quite stressed or overwhelmed to being in a more relaxed or contented state. We often see children who perhaps are neurodiverse or autistic who seem to be on the go. And one of the assumptions that we often make when we observe that behaviour is that they perhaps need more movement. But what we think about less is the fact that perhaps what they need is to be guided in terms of exploring how they can be better regulated. So how they can spend more time in the kind of calm part of their brain, if you like. When children are sort of overwhelmed or seem to be kind of racing and seem to be kind of on the go, often they're kind of functioning in what we call the sympathetic part of their nervous system. And that really is, it sounds lovely, but it's actually the part of their nervous system that probably is leading them to have some uncomfortable feelings. And it's difficult to feel calm when you're in that system. So what we would want is for them to be in the part of our nervous system called the parasympathetic system. And this part of the system is really often referred to as kind of rest and digest. So it's the part of our system where we tend to be more relaxed and we can perhaps experience feelings of contentment. What happens when we become quite stressed and we enter into that sympathetic part of our nervous system is that our breathing pattern changes. And so that can lead us to have quite a sort of very rapid and quite shallow breathing pattern. And when that happens, it signals to our body that we are quite stressed. And so the body responds by changing blood flow, for example. So our blood flow tends to then flow much more to things like our heart and our extremities, so our arms and our legs, to prepare us for fighting or running away from a situation that's overwhelming us or maybe scaring us, that type of thing. It also directs blood away from our internal organs, so things like our digestive system or our bladder, for example. And so we can experience symptoms that are associated with sort of poor digestion. We can have upset tummies. Sometimes we experience things like butterflies, those kind of things. And sometimes we can feel nauseous, and sometimes we can feel like we need to wee, particularly if we're sort of nervous or anxious about something. And in extreme situations, sometimes people can go into a kind of a situation that we call shutdown. And this is a kind of part of the system where it's sometimes referred to as freeze, so a freeze state. And in this system, our bodies kind of slow down. And we can feel oftentimes quite disconnected from our body or our environment. And sometimes we find that children who perhaps are typically verbal, so who can communicate through speaking, when they go into shutdown can often become non-speaking and find it difficult to communicate. So when we can regulate our breathing pattern, when we can increase oxygen intake into our system, we stimulate our parasympathetic nervous system. And that's why we tend to use activities that we feel are going to support children to have a different breathing pattern. So a breathing pattern where they're able to breathe in much more of that oxygen into their system. And we know from literature that doing things like changing your breathing pattern can significantly reduce those feelings of anxiety. And when it's paired with other activities, so perhaps vestibular activities, so gentle rocking activities, and sometimes things like deep pressure, then it can really support us to kind of function and stay in that contentment sort of system.
Thank you. I was wondering, the same way you said that it affects people different way when we are stressed, I was wondering if you think breathing techniques work for everyone, or if each person has to find their own beneficial exercises.
I think sometimes we assume that the same strategies work for everybody, and sometimes the research tells us that something is effective but doesn't necessarily think about how easy it is for the person to engage with that particular strategy. And breathing strategies are not for everybody. And sometimes for some people, focusing on their breathing can actually kind of cause people to become uncomfortable, and can actually cause people to go into a state where they are perhaps hyperventilating or having very shallow breathing. So we really have to understand who we're working with and understand the circumstances around their situation, to be able to advise them. And like many things, anything to do with kind of working on breathing is perhaps trial and error. So something that they might want to experiment with a little bit to see what suits them. For children and young people, using breathing techniques can be quite abstract. So for adults, it can be quite a difficult and challenging thing to do, but for children, it can be particularly abstract. And it's important to ensure that where possible, we can chat to children about what's happening in their body and give them information. Oftentimes information is power, and it really helps children to understand what's happening and why they're feeling the way that they feel. It's best not to use these strategies or to try and attempt to teach strategies when children are in a kind of a stressful state or when they're feeling distressed. Those are definitely not teaching times. And even if we might have practiced them at another time, if that child is unable to engage with it, it's best not to try and pursue it until they are feeling more calm and they're more able to communicate. Another important thing to remember is that we all experience our bodies very, very differently. So we're all very different people, and we all have very different sensations. We're all very different sensory beings. And there's a growing body of research that talks about interoception, but in particular talks about interoception within the autistic community, and that sometimes for autistic people, it can be quite challenging to detect those internal signals. So those are signals that come from inside our body that might tell us things like whether we're hungry or thirsty, whether we're hot or cold, whether we need to go to the toilet, and also things like emotional changes. So we sense our emotions within our body, and people can have really different experiences in terms of where they experience emotions or changes in internal sensations. So it's really important that we honour what young people tell us about their experience, and that we validate their experience. And just because it's different from ours, it doesn't mean that that's not what they're experiencing. The other thing that we have to think about is that co-regulation is also a very, very valid tool for regulating. And from when we were very little, co-regulation is something that we would have used. Our parents might have gently rocked us, so giving us soothing vestibular input. They might have held us and hugged us, so giving really comforting deep pressure or proprioceptive input. And when we were close to them, we could monitor their breathing, so we could hear their breathing, we could hear their heart rate. And so things like that all contribute to co-regulation. And just because we become older or we grow up, it doesn't mean that we don't rely on co-regulation as well. It's still a really valid source of being able to regulate. And as adults, often if we need comfort, we will speak to somebody we love, or we will see a friend, for example, those kind of things. And the other thing it's important to be aware of is that as parents, when our child is distressed, it also makes changes for us. So it also causes us to experience differences in our self-regulation, and that we can quite easily become stressed or overwhelmed or upset if we see our child in distress. And so it's important for us also to have the ability to talk about those things, to ensure that we have the language around it, and to make sure that we also explore strategies. And sometimes that can be a nice thing to do with our young person or our child.
Thank you. I realize you mentioned a little bit of some examples of what exercise could benefit, but could you recommend us some examples of minimum and feasible breathing exercises that might help autistic children?
Yes, absolutely. There's a range of different activities that you can try. Sometimes people will use a kind of a direct and straightforward breathing technique. So you can see those things, and there are a couple of examples of that within the zones of regulation, which is sometimes used by parents. It's quite often implemented in schools as well. So those resources are available. And there is, for example, a lazy 8 breathing. So you follow around the figure of 8, breathing in and then breathing out as you go. So that can be quite useful. There is another one which is where you imagine that your 5 fingers are candles, and you take a breath in and you blow, and each time you blow you put a finger down. It requires some fine motor skills as well, being able to isolate your finger movements, but it's another way again of having a visual but being able to control your breathing using that kind of visual support as well. So those are some kind of standalone breathing strategies that you can use. But generally, when I work with children and young people, I try and incorporate other parts of them, if you like, into the activity, because breathing strategies can be very sort of abstract and difficult to follow. So there's a range of different things we can do, perhaps incorporating play or incorporating other things that young person enjoys. So I'll give you some examples of those things. So one of the things that we can use with movement is using a peanut ball or a physiotherapy ball, and having the child on their tummy with their hands on the floor and their feet on the floor, and just gently rocking them forwards and backwards. And with the in-breath, as they move forward, they take a breath in, and as they move backwards, they breathe out. And we can also put some pressure through their back while we're doing that, so they're getting some deep pressure and some nice kind of grounding body feedback as well. Sometimes using visual toys can be successful. So you can get expanding balls, for example, or stretchy toys and things like that. So encouraging the child to breathe in as it expands, and then breathing out as it becomes smaller or retracts. So those can be really nice, useful visual tools to use. Blowing bubbles. I don't think I know anybody who doesn't like bubbles. I'm sure there are people, but for lots of people, bubbles are quite pleasurable. For lots of children and young people, they're really pleasurable. Not every child can blow, so it can't always be used for children in terms of regulating their breathing, but it is also a really nice kind of visual stim. So it's a really nice kind of visual focus for them that can actually be quite grounding and quite restful to see bubbles gently floating on the air. If they can blow, then it's really nice for regulating breathing. So you're doing lots of breathing out. So if they've been doing shallow breathing and carbon dioxide is built up in their system, by doing lots of breathing out, by blowing into the wand, they're releasing some of that carbon dioxide, and they'll reduce some of those anxiety symptoms they might have. Combining things like music, gentle rhythmic movement, and breath work can be really helpful. For some people, it's using dance. For other people, it might be using things like yoga or those types of things, so stretches and stretching the body. And we know lots of young people who are autistic will also have comorbidities with things like hypermobility syndrome. So sometimes they need much more feedback through their joints. So doing stretches and getting movement can be really helpful in terms of helping them regulate and ground themselves. And then using things like pressure, so deep pressure or tapping, to ground the child in their body, enable them to kind of feel their body. And this is particularly nice if they have been in a shutdown sort of phase, if they've been highly distressed. So just bringing them gently back into their body. But obviously we don't do to the child. The child needs to really ideally do it to themselves or allow us to do it because they want it. So they obviously need to give consent, and it obviously has to be something that they're happy to happen. And then I've sort of talked a little bit about using bubbles as a visual stim, but also using other things. So sometimes lights, things that spin can be really helpful in calming the child and helping them regulate breathing. Using pinwheels, so they're a bit like a windmill on a stick, so you can blow it and it spins. So the child again is using their breath, but they're also getting a nice kind of visual focus as well. Using a body sock, so lycra body sock, again, a bit like the principle of using the expanding ball or a stretchy toy. So they're pushing out as they're breathing in, and then when they're breathing out, they're kind of bringing their arms back in. And then things like blow football. So using a ping pong ball, or you can roll up paper into balls and use a straw and blow those balls into a goal or something that you've set up. So sometimes cutting a large paper cup in half is a really nice little goal for them to aim for. But again, engaging them in kind of blow football or blow races and things like that are quite nice ideas. And then pairing activities with small spaces. So lots of children are better regulated when they're in small spaces. So that might be in a dark den, it might be in a lycra swing, it might be in a beanbag. They might like den building, for example, and things like that. So using strategies together can be really powerful. So it's important that when we're using strategies, we're having conversations with young people about how these things feel, so that they're able to identify things that feel pleasurable and things that aren't pleasant. And when we do that, we enable them to begin to kind of name the things that help them to be calm. But also we can create a toolkit, so we can create an idea of the things that give them pleasure and enable them to be regulated. Sometimes people refer to pleasurable activities as glimmers. So it's really nice to look at what your child does to get pleasure, to enjoy themselves, and think about whether or not those things could be useful tools in helping them self-regulate as well. And another, so final tip really is using games that change the state of the body. So sometimes using games that perhaps get the heart rate going, sort of make breathing faster, increase body temperature, maybe feel different. So using water play or using lotion on the skin. All of those activities are really nice activities to have a conversation about how that feels to the body. And drawing that young person's attention to the body and thinking about sensations and what's pleasant and what isn't. So just doing those exploratory activities and having conversations and allowing them to identify, things as they experience them, rather than how we would perceive that they might experience them. Those are really powerful opportunities.
Well, you have done an incredible job explaining. I think you did really great. And I think these are like super nice activities for parents and carers to introduce to their children. So this is the end of the interview. Thank you, Gemma. I think we have learned, all of us, a lot from you. I hope families can get help from this. And I really appreciate you here. I really am super thankful for this. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's obviously by no means an exhaustive list. And I guess the important thing to take away really is that whatever we're doing needs to be a collaborative approach. So, we work with our children and young people, and that many families already have some really fantastic strategies that they use and have a really expert knowledge of their child or young person. And these perhaps might kind of add to that toolbox already.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.